The Roman Empire, a sprawling colossus of power and conquest, was not felled by a single blow. It was a long, slow, agonizing death, a sepsis of the soul where the instruments of its demise were forged in its own paranoid heart. This is the story of that fall, told not through dates and treaties, but through the grim language of execution. It begins in chaos, in the so-called crisis of the 3rd century, a 50-year-long death spiral of assassination and civil war. Here, the throne was not inherited, it was seized, and the price of failure was a brutal public death. The Emperor Caracalla, a man who murdered his own brother Geta in their mother's arms, set a horrifying precedent. His paranoia was a disease, leading to a purge of anyone suspected of sympathizing with his dead sibling. Thousands were put to the sword, their loyalty questioned, their lives extinguished on the whim of a tyrant. Caracalla's own end was fittingly ignominious, stabbed to death by a soldier while urinating by the side of a road. His successor, Maximinus, was the Praetorian prefect who likely orchestrated the plot, a perfect example of the violent opportunism that now defined Roman politics. The man who wielded the knife, Martialis, was supposedly avenging his brother, who had been executed on Caracalla's orders. This chain of vengeance, from the emperor down to the common soldier, was the engine of the crisis. The brief reign of Elagabalus was next, a whirlwind of religious scandal and debauchery that offended the stoic sensibilities of the Roman elite. His end was a mob affair, a brutal lynching by the Praetorian Guard he had alienated. He and his mother were butchered in the latrines of the army camp, their bodies dragged through the streets of Rome like common criminals. Their corpses were then unceremoniously dumped into the Tiber River, denying even the dignity of a proper burial. His successor, Severus Alexander, ruled for 13 years, a brief island of stability in a sea of chaos. But he too fell to the army's greed. When he tried to use diplomacy and bribery to deal with Germanic tribes instead of warfare, his own legions felt cheated of plunder. Led by the giant Maximinus Thrax, the soldiers mutinied, storming the emperor's tent and cutting him and his mother down without mercy, their blood soaking into the campaign maps of a war they would never fight. Maximinus Thrax, the first of the so-called barracks emperors, was a brutal soldier who had risen from the lowest ranks. He trusted no one, least of all the Senate, and initiated a terrifying purge of Alexander's advisors and friends. Men were crucified, sewn into the skins of animals, and left to die or beaten to death with clubs. His reign was not one of governance, but of pure paranoid terror, funded by the systematic extortion of the aristocracy. The Senate, pushed to its breaking point, declared Maximinus an enemy of the state and elevated their own emperors, Gordian I and Gordian II. Their rebellion was short-lived and ended in tragedy. In North Africa, Gordian II was killed in battle, and upon hearing the news, his elderly father, Gordian I, hanged himself with his own belt. The hope of the Senate died with them, a grim suicide in a governor's palace, a testament to the futility of resisting military might. Maximinus, enraged, marched on Italy, but his brutality had become his own undoing. His siege of the city of Aquileia stalled, and his own troops, starving and miserable, turned on him. Soldiers of the Praetorian Guard crept into his tent as he slept and murdered him, his son, and his chief ministers. Their heads were cut off, placed on poles, and displayed to the joyous citizens of Aquileia, a grotesque celebration of liberation from a monster of their own making. The chaos continued with a rapid succession of emperors, each murdering his predecessor. Philip the Arab killed Gordian III. Decius then killed Philip in battle. Decius, in turn, initiated the first empire-wide systematic persecution of Christians, a new kind of state-sponsored execution. It was not merely political, it was ideological. Christians were rounded up, forced to make public sacrifices to the Roman gods, and those who refused were subjected to horrific tortures and executions. The methods were designed for maximum public terror. They were burned alive on pyres that lit up the city squares, their screams a warning to others. They were crucified, a punishment reserved for the lowest criminals, left to die slowly in agony. In the arenas, they were thrown to starving lions and bears, their faith turned into a gruesome spectacle for the masses. The goal was to break their spirit, to make an example so terrifying that their religion would simply cease to exist. Decius himself did not enjoy his reign for long. He was killed fighting the Goths, the first Roman emperor to die in battle against a foreign enemy. His body, lost in a swamp, was never recovered. He became a ghost, a cautionary tale of an emperor who tried to unify the empire through blood and sacrifice, only to be consumed by the very chaos he sought to control. His persecution, while brutal, had failed. It only strengthened the resolve of the Christian Church. The horror reached a new peak with the Emperor Valerian. Captured in battle by the Persian king, Shapur I, he suffered the ultimate humiliation. Shapur used the living Roman emperor as a human footstool, stepping on his back to mount his horse. This degradation, witnessed by the defeated Roman army, was a psychological blow from which the empire's prestige would never fully recover. The master of the world had become a slave. Valerian's death was even more gruesome. After years of servitude, Shapur had him executed by forcing him to drink molten gold, a symbolic punishment for Rome's perceived greed. The torment did not end there. Valerian's body was then flayed, his skin stuffed with straw and painted with crimson and put on display in a Persian temple. It was a grotesque trophy, a perpetual reminder of Persia's victory and Rome's shame, a skinned emperor for all to see. In the chaos, the empire fractured. In the west, the Gallic Empire broke away. In the east, the Parmenian Empire rose under the warrior queen Zenobia. The Roman world was literally tearing itself apart. Usurpers were a plague, each carving out a piece of the dying beast for themselves. Each new claimant to the throne marked his ascension with the blood of his predecessor and a purge of his followers, a relentless, grinding cycle of murder. The Emperor Aurelian, a tough Illyrian general, began the process of stitching the empire back together, but his methods were soaked in blood. He defeated Zenobia and sacked the magnificent city of Palmyra, slaughtering its citizens. He reconquered Gaul, executing the usurper Tetricus, though he spared his life for the public triumph. Aurelian's message was simple: unity would be restored, and the price for resisting it was annihilation. Even this restorer of the world, Aurelian, was not safe. While preparing a campaign against Persia, he was assassinated by his own officials. A secretary, fearing punishment for a minor lie, forged a document listing the names of senior commanders marked for execution. Terrified, the commanders ambushed and killed Aurelian, only to discover the deception later. The emperor who saved the empire was murdered because of a clerical error and the pervasive fear he himself had cultivated. This relentless cycle of murder at the top created a culture of extreme cruelty throughout the military. Discipline was maintained through a practice known as decimation. If a unit was found guilty of cowardice or mutiny, the soldiers would draw lots, and 1 in every 10 men would be clubbed or stoned to death by his own comrades. It was a horrific spectacle designed to instill obedience through terror, forcing soldiers to become the executioners of their friends. The arrival of Diocletian, another Illyrian soldier emperor, marked a turning point. He understood that the empire was too large and chaotic for one man to rule. He created the Tetrarchy, a system of 4 rulers, 2 senior Augusti and 2 junior Caesars, to govern the vast territory. It was an attempt to manage the succession crisis and end the cycle of assassination. But this new order was built on a foundation of absolute, divine authority and enforced with an iron fist. Diocletian's court was transformed into a place of terrifying ceremony and ritual. He was no longer the first citizen, but a living god, Dominus et Deus. To approach him, one had to perform proskenses, prostrating oneself fully on the ground. This elevation of the emperor was meant to make him untouchable, to lift him above the bloody fray of military politics. But it also created a vast, unbridgeable gulf between the ruler and his subjects, a ruler who held the power of life and death as a divine right. To secure his new order, Diocletian unleashed the Great Persecution, the most vicious and widespread attack on Christians the empire had ever seen. Edicts were passed demanding the destruction of churches, the burning of scriptures, and the arrest of clergy. It was a systematic attempt to erase a belief system that Diocletian saw as a threat to the traditional Roman values and the unity of his state. The executions that followed were as methodical as they were monstrous. Across the empire, governors competed to invent new and more hideous forms of execution. Victims were scraped with iron hooks until their bones were exposed. They were slowly roasted over gentle fires. Molten lead was poured down their throats. Their limbs were tied to bent trees, which were then released, tearing the victim apart. This was not just killing. It was a calculated campaign of psychological warfare designed to horrify and intimidate the populace into submission. The story of Saint Sebastian is emblematic of this era's cruelty. An officer of the Praetorian Guard, he was discovered to be a Christian and condemned by Diocletian himself. He was taken to a field, tied to a post, and used for archery practice by his fellow soldiers. Riddled with arrows until he resembled a porcupine, he was left for dead. This act of turning a soldier's own comrades into his executioners was a particularly vicious twist of the knife, a punishment for ultimate betrayal of the Roman military ethos. Amazingly, Sebastian survived this ordeal, nursed back to health by a Christian widow. Instead of fleeing, he went to confront Diocletian, haranguing him for his cruelty towards the Christians. Stunned by the appearance of a man he thought dead, the emperor recovered and ordered him to be beaten to death with clubs. His body was then thrown into the Cloaca Maxima, the great sewer of Rome, a final act of desecration to deny him a martyr's burial. The Tetrarchy, for all its brutal enforcement, eventually collapsed back into civil war. When Diocletian and his co-emperor Maximian abdicated, their successors immediately began to scheme and fight. The system designed to prevent conflict became its incubator. One of these contenders was Constantine, the son of a Western Caesar. His rise to sole power would be a story written in the blood of his rivals, a Christian emperor who was every bit as ruthless as his pagan predecessors. Constantine's most famous battle was at the Milvian Bridge, outside Rome, against his rival Maxentius. According to legend, Constantine had a vision of a Christian symbol in the sky and the words, "In this sign, you will conquer." He ordered his soldiers to paint the symbol on their shields. The battle was a resounding victory. Maxentius and his army were driven into the Tiber River, where they drowned in the press of their own terrified men, weighed down by their armor. After the battle, Constantine entered Rome as a liberator, but his vengeance was swift. The severed head of Maxentius was paraded through the city on a spear before being sent to Africa to signal the end of the rebellion. He then systematically purged Maxentius's key supporters, executing them and confiscating their property. The Christian symbol may have been on his banners, but the methods were pure Roman tradition: terror, execution, and the public display of the vanquished. Constantine still had one major rival left, Licinius, the emperor in the east. After years of uneasy alliance, war broke out. Constantine was victorious, and Licinius surrendered under the promise that his life would be spared. Constantine swore an oath to his own sister, Licinius's wife, that he would not be harmed. It was a lie. A few months later, on the pretext of a conspiracy, Constantine had Licinius and his young son, his own nephew, strangled to death. Now the sole master of the Roman world, Constantine's paranoia, the old imperial disease, began to fester. The most shocking and mysterious executions of his reign were those of his own family. He ordered the death of his eldest son and heir, Crispus, a brilliant and popular military commander. The reasons are lost to history, shrouded in courtly intrigue and rumor. Crispus was arrested, tried in secret, and executed without public explanation, a son erased by his own father. The tragedy deepened only months later when Constantine also ordered the execution of his wife, the Empress Fausta. The ancient sources claim she was suffocated in an overheated bath, a private and terrifying way to die. It is whispered that Fausta had slandered Crispus, perhaps accusing him of trying to seduce her, and when Constantine discovered her lie, his grief-twisted rage turned upon her. The emperor had murdered his son, then murdered his wife for causing him to do so. The Christian emperor, the supposed bringer of a new era of peace, had committed the ultimate sins of kinslaying, staining his hands with the blood of his own son and wife. To silence all gossip and memory, he enacted a damnatio memoriae against them, ordering their names to be chiseled from all public inscriptions and their statues destroyed. It was a second death, an attempt to obliterate their very existence from history, a testament to the absolute and terrifying power of the emperor. Constantine's new capital, Constantinople, was built on the foundations of this bloody family tragedy. It was a city dedicated to a Christian god, but ruled by a man who operated by the old, ruthless pagan rules. He established a vast network of spies and secret police, the agents in rebus, who spread fear throughout the empire. Denunciations were encouraged, and treason trials became a common tool for eliminating potential rivals and seizing their wealth. Upon Constantine's death, his three sons inherited the empire and immediately began a bloodbath to secure their power. They orchestrated a massacre of their male relatives, including 2 of their uncles and 7 of their cousins. The soldiers of Constantinople, supposedly in a fit of loyalty, carried out the purge, dragging ministers and princes from the palace and cutting them down. The sons claimed to be horrified, but it was clear they had consolidated their rule by exterminating any potential rival claimants. The brothers soon turned on each other, plunging the empire back into the civil wars their father had fought so hard to end. Constantine II was killed, invading the territory of his brother Constans. A decade later, Constans himself was assassinated by a usurper named Magnentius. The final brother, Constantius II, then waged a long and bloody war to defeat the usurper, a war that cost the lives of tens of thousands of the empire's best soldiers. Constantius II was as paranoid and cruel as any of his predecessors. His reign was dominated by treason trials, often overseen by notoriously brutal officials like the notary Paulus, nicknamed the Chain. Accusations of magic and sorcery became a common pretext for arresting and executing wealthy individuals. Victims were tortured with fire and iron hooks to extract confessions and the names of other conspirators, feeding a self-perpetuating cycle of state-sponsored terror and expropriation. The brief reign of Julian, known as the Apostate for his attempt to restore paganism, ended with his death in battle against the Persians. His successor, Jovian, was found dead in his tent, possibly from carbon monoxide poisoning from a charcoal brazier, or perhaps something more sinister. The throne was a death sentence, and the empire continued to churn through rulers, its stability perpetually undermined by the fragility of a single human life. Next came the Pannonian brothers, Valentinian and Valens. Valentinian, who ruled the West, was a man of terrifying rage. He was known for keeping 2 massive pet bears, named Gold, Grain, and Innocence, to whom he would personally feed condemned prisoners. He would watch as the bears tore the victims apart, a spectator to his own savage form of execution. His rages were legendary. He once had a stable master beaten to death simply because a horse was not properly groomed. Valentinian's own death was a direct result of his uncontrollable temper. While berating a delegation of Quadi envoys, he worked himself into such a fury that he burst a blood vessel in his brain and died on the spot. He literally exploded with rage. It was a bizarre and fitting end for a man who had ruled through pure, explosive violence, a victim of his own internalized brutality. In the East, his brother Valens presided over one of the greatest military disasters in Roman history, the Battle of Adrianople. He allowed a massive Gothic army into the empire as refugees, then his corrupt officials mistreated them so badly that they rose in rebellion. Valens, foolishly rushing into battle without his Western counterpart, was surrounded and annihilated. Two-thirds of his army was slaughtered, and the emperor himself was either struck by an arrow or burned alive in a farmhouse where he had taken refuge. The disaster at Adrianople was a death blow from which the Western Roman Empire would never recover. It shattered the myth of the legion's invincibility and left the army critically undermanned. The new emperor, Theodosius, was forced to make a treaty that allowed the Goths to settle within the empire as a self-governing nation. This was the beginning of the end, the establishment of a barbarian state within the state, a cancer that would grow and eventually consume its host. Theodosius is also remembered for an act of shocking brutality against his own citizens. When the people of Thessalonica rioted and killed a Gothic military commander, Theodosius, in a fit of rage, ordered a general massacre. His soldiers sealed the exits of the city's circus and slaughtered the spectators inside for 3 hours. Men, women, and children were cut down indiscriminately. As many as 7,000 people were butchered, a punishment of insane and disproportionate cruelty. This massacre so horrified the powerful bishop Ambrose of Milan that he excommunicated the emperor, barring him from church. To be remitted, Theodosius was forced to perform public penance, stripping off his imperial robes and begging for forgiveness. This was a stunning moment in history. A spiritual leader, armed only with moral authority, forcing the most powerful man in the world to publicly atone for an act of mass murder. It signaled a major shift in the balance of power between church and state. After Theodosius, the Western Empire was ruled by a series of weak, childlike emperors, with real power wielded by barbarian generals in their service. The most brilliant of these was Stilicho, a Vandal who served as regent for the young Emperor Honorius. Stilicho repeatedly defeated invaders like the Goths under Alaric and Radagaisus, single-handedly holding the crumbling empire together through his military genius. But Stilicho's success and barbarian heritage bred jealousy and suspicion in the Roman court. A rival minister, Olympius, whispered poison in the emperor's ear, accusing Stilicho of treason, of plotting to place his own son on the throne. Honorius, weak and easily swayed, believed the lies. He ordered the arrest and execution of the one man who could have saved Rome. Stilicho, who could have easily started a civil war, chose loyalty to the end and surrendered. Stilicho was beheaded without a proper trial. His execution triggered a horrific pogrom against the families of barbarian soldiers serving in the Roman army. Thousands of innocent women and children were massacred by Roman troops in a frenzy of xenophobic rage. This act of senseless cruelty had a catastrophic result. 30,000 of the army's best barbarian soldiers, enraged by the murder of their families, defected en masse to their former enemy, Alaric the Goth. With Stilicho dead and the Roman army gutted by desertions, there was no one left to stop Alaric. He marched his reinforced army into Italy and laid siege to the city of Rome itself. The Senate, desperate, tried to appease him with gold, but his demands grew. Starvation gripped the eternal city. The citizens, starving and desperate, resorted to cannibalism. In their paranoia, they executed Stilicho's widow, Serena, baselessly accusing her of conspiring with the Goths. In the year 410, the unthinkable happened. Through treachery, the Salarian Gate was opened, and Alaric's Goths entered and sacked Rome. For 3 days, the city that had conquered the world was subjected to pillage, rape, and murder. Houses were burned, treasures were looted, and citizens were tortured to reveal their hidden wealth. While not a complete destruction, the psychological impact was earth-shattering. The eternal city had fallen. Honorius, the emperor, was safe in his new capital of Ravenna, protected by marshes. The historian Procopius tells a morbidly absurd story about his reaction. When a eunuch rushed in crying, "Rome has perished," the emperor was distraught, thinking he was talking about his favorite pet chicken, also named Rome. When the confusion was cleared up, he was relieved. The story, even if apocryphal, perfectly captures the detachment and impotence of the later Roman emperors. The next great general to arise was Flavius Aetius, often called the last of the Romans. For decades, he skillfully played barbarian tribes against each other, using Hunnic mercenaries to keep the Goths and Franks in check. His masterpiece was the Battle of the Catalonian Plains, where he forged a coalition of Romans and Visigoths to defeat the massive invasion of Attila the Hun, saving Western Europe from the scourge of God. Like Stilicho before him, Aetius's power and success were seen as a threat by a weak and jealous emperor, Valentinian III. Fearing Aetius was too powerful, the emperor conspired with his chamberlain to murder him. During a meeting in the palace to discuss financial reports, as Aetius was reading a document, Valentinian suddenly leaped from his throne and with his chamberlain stabbed the unarmed general to death. The emperor himself delivered the first blow. When the emperor later boasted of his deed to a senator, the man coldly replied, "I do not know whether you have done well or ill, but I know that you have cut off your right hand with your left." The prediction was accurate. 6 months later, Valentinian III was assassinated in public by 2 of Aetius's loyal bodyguards. They simply walked up to the emperor during a military review and cut him down. No one lifted a finger to help him. The empire's protector was dead, and now its emperor was too. The murder of Valentinian created a power vacuum that invited disaster. The Vandal king, Gaiseric, saw his opportunity. Sailing from his kingdom in North Africa, he landed in Italy and marched on Rome. The city was defenseless. Pope Leo I managed to persuade Gaiseric not to burn the city or massacre its people, but he could not prevent a second, far more thorough sack. For 14 days, the Vandals systematically stripped Rome of its remaining wealth. The final decades of the Western Empire were a tragic farce. Emperors were appointed and deposed at will by barbarian warlords, most notably the Suebian general Ricimer, the ultimate puppeteer. He appointed at least 4 different emperors, ruling through them as his puppets. When one of them, Majorian, showed too much independence and competence, Ricimer had him arrested, tortured, and beheaded. Any hope of a Roman revival was personally executed by the man who held the real power. The end, when it came, was not a bang, but a whimper. In the year 476, the Germanic chieftain Odoacer deposed the last Western Roman emperor. This final emperor was a young boy, ironically named Romulus Augustulus, combining the name of Rome's founder with a diminutive of its first emperor. Odoacer saw no need to kill him or even to appoint a new puppet. He simply pensionied the boy off to a villa in the countryside. The imperial regalia, the purple robes and diadem, were bundled up and sent to the Eastern Roman Emperor in Constantinople. The message was clear. The West no longer needed an emperor. The office, which had been the object of so much ambition, bloodshed, and murder for centuries, was now declared obsolete. It was not conquered in a great battle, but simply dissolved, its authority having long since evaporated in endless cycles of execution and civil war. Looking back, the fall of Rome was a chronicle of self-inflicted wounds. The constant purges of the aristocracy stripped the empire of its administrative class. The endless civil wars bled the legions dry, forcing the recruitment of increasingly unreliable barbarian mercenaries. The political instability, where the average reign of a 3rd-century emperor was only a couple of years, made any long-term planning impossible. The empire was in a constant state of emergency, lurching from one assassination to the next. The culture of execution shaped the Roman psyche. It bred a deep-seated paranoia in its rulers and a fatalistic cynicism in its people. When life was so cheap, and when the emperor himself could be a victim of a roadside stabbing or a palace conspiracy, the very concepts of law, order, and stability became a grim joke. The state, which was meant to protect its citizens, became the primary instrument of their terror, a machine that consumed its own children to keep its gears turning. From the paranoid purges of Caracalla to the ideological terror of Diocletian, from the familial bloodletting of Constantine to the jealous murders of Aetius and Stilicho, the story is the same. The very tools used to seize and maintain power, the assassin's dagger, the executioner's axe, the torturer's brand, were the pathogens that rotted the empire from the inside out. Rome did not just fall, it was murdered, and the assassins were Romans themselves.